Hi, it's Dwyer of Dwyercrime.blog, also gamblersadvisory.com. Today is Monday, May 16th, 2022. Let's talk about the West Memphis 3. But first, remember, the opinion you should follow should be your own. Just consider this video to be a second opinion from a complete stranger online. Now, these are the kind of cases that have made the true crime genre, right? Because the case is an absolute farce. I don't believe any of the defendants had anything whatsoever to do with the murders of the victims. Understand, too, that the situation here is cloudy. We don't know if law enforcement was just incompetent or whether there's more to it than that. Right? Just understand that within the last few months, West Memphis Police Department Chief Mike Pope resigned. Now, the party line is that he resigned for personal reasons unrelated to the West Memphis 3 prosecution. But just understand that an attorney for Damien Echols named Patrick Bensa then went to West Memphis after the resignation. And of course, he was able to find in the police files evidence that previously had been reported missing. Right, here's a quote from him. "We found the ligatures. We got what we needed." Folks, the ligatures are vital pieces of evidence that should have been front and center at the 1994 trial. So you're dealing with a situation where, as we'll discuss, the prosecution's theory of the case is sketchy at best. The evidence they presented was weak at best. And of course, the evidence that they presented may not have been all of the evidence. Let's talk about it. First, procedurally, this case is a farce. As in the Scott Peterson case, in my opinion, you have clear jury misconduct here. You have at least one jury member sharing inadmissible evidence that she received in part from press reports and outside sources with other jurors. In other words, the court said, hey, lawyers, you can't present this evidence. And yet, a jury member was able to present this evidence to other jury members. Now, in terms of the actual evidence presented, apart from the confession of Jesse Miscarriage and the alleged confession of Damien Echols to a third party who admittedly feared the law and who admits that she lied to police about the confession, whatever statements the police received seemed to me to be coerced. The prosecution had little to work with, and in my opinion, in a perfect world, no chance of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. Now let's just point out some obvious facts, and rather than give a lengthy recitation of the facts, what I want to do is just target key areas. I understand this is an old case. I understand it's been discussed ad nauseum on true crime venues and podcasts. But I need for people to understand that no one sees any of the young teenage defendants with any of the murder victims. There is no forensic evidence linking any of the teenage defendants to the murdered boys. Now, keeping in mind that Jesse Miskelly's IQ was in the 70s, in other words, it was low, and that Damien Echols was on mental disability, there is no evidence that I've come across that suggests that these teenagers were organized enough to subdue, to strip, and to hogtie each boy, each murder victim, with their own shoelaces. Right? And then, of course, there's no evidence that these teenage defendants would then be organized enough to drown the three boys without being noticed. Most teenage guys, and I was a teenage guy once, most teenage guys can't even change a diaper. None of these guys seemed organized enough to pull it off. Echols was a Satanist, but yet there simply is no evidence, none whatsoever, of him ever trying to kill kids as human sacrifices. There is simply no history. It's a leap, quite frankly, to hear that someone is a Satanist and then to immediately assume that they would kill, hogtie, throw in a drainage ditch, a young murder victim. Also understand, even if Echols is a Satanist, why would the other two teens who are from the area go along? No, I believe the actual killer is practiced with a history of assaulting boys, perhaps sexually, and then covering their tracks. This crime requires practice and planning. I just don't see that with these three teenage defendants. Years after the trial, we learned that none of the defendants' DNA, none, was at the murder scene. The bite marks at the murder scene don't match any of the defendants. Let's also use common sense. I'm not convinced that the boys were killed on May 5th. They are seen playing at 6:30 p.m. 8-year-old victim Chris Byers' father, John Mark Byers, calls police at 7 p.m. The police search starts the next morning, and these boys aren't found until 1:45 p.m. Several hours later. These murders took time. The location was carefully chosen. The actual killer was missing for some time and may have lured the kids to someplace private before dumping them where the bodies were found. As I've said, the killer was practiced and thought out. I believe some of the evidence is to throw law enforcement off the scent. So you have 3 different types of knots used on the 3 different sets of shoelaces. That suggests to me that someone is making these knots and has thought it out, and they're trying to convince police that 3 different people, or at least more than one person, did the 3 murders. Now, you may have heard about how one murder victim's genitalia was mutilated. You should know that expert witness, and he's known worldwide, Werner Spitz, contends that the alleged knife injuries to Chris Byers' genitalia was caused by wild animals and turtles, not knife cutting as the prosecution's satanic ritual narrative suggests. Now keep in mind that without the satanic ritual angle, there is no reason to believe that Damien Echols would be involved in the murders. I don't believe the killer is the black guy who shows up with blood on him at a nearby Bojangles chicken restaurant. Do you think that a guy with a cast on one arm could have subdued 3 8-year-olds? I was an 8-year-old once. And then hogtied them. Right? The black guy at the Bojangles who goes in the women's bathroom is wearing a cast. Understand, 1, black hair is found at the scene. But people need to realize how messy the scene was, how perfectly picked it was. It's a drainage ditch. A lot of things drain there, even when there aren't dead bodies there. Understand, this is professionally done. Because the drainage ditch is going to have a lot of extraneous debris. Right? So the fact that 1 black hair, and again it's 1, was found at the drainage ditch area doesn't tell me that an African American or someone of African descent did this crime. Understand too, there's no evidence, none, that this particular black guy, the black guy who shows up at Bojangles, was even at the murder scene, because law enforcement in investigating this crime was so bad that they collected and then lost the evidence they retrieved from that Bojangles, including blood smears allegedly left by the black guy who ended up in the women's bathroom. Also think about it too. You've just done these murders. You have blood on you to the point where you're leaving blood smears. And you're going to go to a public restaurant? Really? That to me sounds like a red herring. I just don't see the evidence that links the black guy at Bojangles to the 3 murder victims. Let's get more controversial. Let's discuss someone who has been hinted at in some circles as the possible killer. Nor do I believe the killer is Terry Hobbs, victim Stephen Branch's stepdad. I understand that a hair found at the scene was consistent with his hair. But people need to realize that they live together. I have no doubt that I probably have lint on this shirt from my girlfriend or from the kids. Right? It's 1 hair from Terry Hobbs. I would argue that when you live with kids, there's a lot of transfer of things like hair. I don't believe that 1 hair shows that Terry Hobbs was at the murder scene. A hair from his friend was also found at the scene, Guess what, folks? If Terry is around his friend, then Terry might have the friend's hairs on him. Right? Understand, Terry and his friend are longtime friends. I'm not convinced that the presence of the friend's hair, and again, it's a lone hair, implies that these two buddies decided to kill 3 kids and then did so. And keep in mind, folks, the murder would be a rough and tumble affair. Right? The kids are bashed. They're stripped. They're hogtied. That's after being subdued. Right? I don't believe that 2 drinking buddies would be organized enough to pull this off and to only leave 2 hairs at the murder scene. That doesn't make sense. Nor do I see the motive in deciding, oh, let's kill your stepson and 2 other kids in a community where they live and are known. That seems like a reach to me. I don't think we know the killer. While the killer might know the town, it's important that we figure out the town. Understand, the bodies were found near the 140/155 interstate highway. You have a lot of strangers, you have a lot of truckers passing through the town. I believe the killer knew the area, but was a visitor. He had a truck or a van and knew of the deserted private area to take the boys, that had the perfect place to leave the boys, a drainage ditch with a lot of other debris. Right? I believe this was thought out well before finding the boys, killing the boys, and then dumping the bodies in the drainage ditch, along with the 2 bikes that were found nearby. Let me say, too, that apparently a lot of kids roam through that area. It was an area where kids liked to play. I don't believe the shoelaces were tied in that area. That would take too much time. That would expose the killer to being detected. Rather, I believe this is a killer who somehow found a way to get the kids in their truck or their van, you name it, then to do the damage there and to spend minimal time at the area where he dumped the kids, where they were later found. Right? Let me also note that there is a Blue Beacon truck wash not too far away. In other words, this was a traveled area. A sadistic pedophile could have had a fantasy about grabbing some kids from that area, and in my opinion, had to have thought this out before it happened. As for local law enforcement, let me just say, many local law enforcement groups are well intended, but just don't have the experience to properly investigate a crime of this magnitude. And you can imagine if 3 local 8-year-old kids are murdered brutally, there's going to be a public outcry. And that's going to lead local law enforcement to try even more desperately to solve the crime. Here, they just didn't have the evidence to pin this on the local Satanists, the local guy with an IQ below 80, and Jason Baldwin, who seems to have had nothing at all to do with any part of this crime. I think Jesse Miscarriage panicked. I think the police had him under questioning for a lengthy period of time, and the poor kid cracked. Said what the police wanted to hear. I think Damien Echols was prosecuted simply because he was different. And in an area that's religious. In a religious area where many people frown upon the idea of being a Satanist, I believe Echols was an easy scapegoat here. Just understand, folks, that outside of the confessions, and they're dubious, there simply is no evidence here to pin these crimes on the three guys who got convicted and then spent several years of their lives in prison. Right? No DNA, no witnesses, no history of attempted human sacrifices. No explanation as to why Miscarriage and Baldwin would go along with a Satanist who decided to kill 3 kids. No explanation as to how the 3 avoided detection. Understand, local people, including Terry Hobbs, went looking for the kids that night. Right? The kids had loving families. A call is made to the police at 7 p.m. that night. Right? The fact that West Memphis is not that big, that these teenagers were known, and that no one saw the teenagers, should tell you that these teenagers did not do the crime. So what I believe is going to happen, now that you actually have the missing evidence suddenly reappear almost 20 years later, after the police chief's resignation, which may or may not be unrelated, what I think you're going to have happen is an actual forensic review of the missing evidence. And I think what we're going to learn is that that evidence is completely unrelated, and I mean completely unrelated, to the 3 teenage defendants. Think about how thought through this crime is too. If you bring in outside material to use as a rope to tie up the murder victims, then it's possible that law enforcement can say, oh, this rope that was used, this rope comes from that place. Let's find out who bought this type of rope from that store. Right? The killer would have left a trail. But no, this is a practiced, rehearsed killer. Not loopy teenagers, but a rehearsed killer who figured out that he wanted to subdue the boys without using outside rope. So he does so with their shoelaces. Right, folks? The 3 defendants should never have been convicted. they should not have spent time in prison. Simply put, this case was a miscarriage of justice. If you feel differently, and if you feel that there is incriminating evidence that you want to discuss, I hope you consider doing so in the comment section of this video on YouTube. Dwyer70905 is the YouTube account. Also, in fact, it's Esquire777. Forgive me. It's Esquire777 on YouTube. You could also find my podcasts on cases like this and other cases at Dwyercrime.blog. Thanks for stopping by.